Hey there, I'm Jackie Ferris. This week on the 302, we are at Winterthur, where we're getting a behind-the-scenes look at the conservation and the science that goes into each and every one of the exhibits that we know and love. You may not realize it, but a lot of work goes in to each and every object, about 90,000 of them to be exact, before they're here and put on display. Get ready for the white glove treatment. The 302 is coming your way. You may not realize it whenever you walk the halls of Winterthur, but a lot goes on before an exhibition can be put on. We're here in the Conservation Department. I'm joined by the Conservation Department Director, Joy Gardner, to talk a little bit about what happens before we show up. Joy, thank you so much for joining us.
Certainly, glad to join.
So you have, what, 90,000 pieces that you have to I guess the word isn't conserve, but treat in order to make sure that it lasts and can be showable.
Well, actually, it is all part of conservation in that our department overlooks not only the treatment, but understanding the objects, doing analysis so that we know what the materials are. We have a whole group for our preventive conservation, where we have people over in the museum, in the house, that do the cleaning, and in the galleries, just to make sure that they stay in as good condition as possible. We keep an eye on the environment, the temperature, relative humidity. We do all kinds of things with the general care, including we have a collection emergency plan that we work with other collections folks in the institution, so that if there is a leak or if there is some problem, we could react and deal with it. But within the department, we have, I think, 12 different areas. We are broken down into specialties. So we're currently in the Textile Conservation Lab, which is where I had spent the majority of my career until I moved to the director position. So here they work with the textile-related objects and costume. So it's needlework, quilts, costume, rugs, the furnishings, the curtains and such. So they have to oversee that again, make sure things on exhibit are in okay condition, keep an eye on how long they're on exhibition. But when things are asked for special exhibitions, they often come over to the lab for examination to really understand what the condition is, what the needs might be, to work with the exhibitions folks as to how this can be displayed. You know, not everything can go up vertical, and if it does, how does it need to be affixed? So there's a lot going on. And so we have textiles, we have paintings, library materials, we have a photographer that we work with, we have objects, and paper and furniture, and then we, as I mentioned, preventive, and we also have the Scientific Research and Analysis Lab. So we're one of 18 museums in the country that have a fully stocked, so we say we have great equipment with our SRAL.
So you guys are the experts, or one of 18 places that can examine something, find out how old it is, what needs to be done to it, etc. I wanted to backtrack a little bit though. Before anything goes out, you know, like for instance, you guys not too long ago had the Costuming the Crown exhibition, where you had to bring in all of these costumes. You had to figure out, you know, how you're going to display them, and you're going to go through that very same process with the Ann Lowe and with the Jackie Kennedy exhibits that are coming up. So talk to me a little bit about getting ready for something like Costuming the Crown or Jackie or Ann Lowe.
Okay, well, with Costuming the Crown and now with Ann Lowe, we get in the objects in enough time so that we can examine them, see what treatment they would need, if anything. But also before things come up here to the lab, we need to make sure that nobody else is coming along with them, in that we have to do some sort of pest eradication with organic objects. So with that, we have a medical grade freezer that we can use, do a 72-hour cycle with that, or we have a carbon dioxide chamber. So that once it goes through that and we're sure that it's clear, then it can come up. And again, looking at the materials, looking at the objects, and with the costume, that adds another dimension because people want to see costumes in the round. You know, a costume flat in a case isn't as exciting as it's being on a form, a human form. And so we have to come up with some inert way, because anything we do, we don't want to be reacting with the object and its materials. And so we're working with the University of Delaware currently to come up with the forms for the Ann Lowe show, to do some computer-operated milling of forms. And in the past, we've had people hand carve the forms out of inert materials. We use ethafoam, and then that's covered with, again, more inert materials to do that. And one of the things with historic costume is that you can't just use whatever mannequin you have. It has to be one that, A, reflects the stance of the time period and the body shape, but also it needs to support the costume. So you may have to alter it so that it's not too small or it's not too tight. I know of some historic, sort of iconic costumes where the elbows have been, there's damage there because it was too tight on the mannequin form. So we have to consider that as well, and how we put that all together. And also think about, you know, if you're going to have arms, heads or not, other accessories. So there's a lot that goes into it.
A lot of work in preparing the costume,
and
thinking about not just the show itself, but you know what's going to happen to it afterwards. Because a lot of these things kind of cycle through here, right? So what would you say is the most unknown, little known fact about what you do?
Little known fact.
What are people surprised to hear whenever you say, oh?
I think just what all is involved, you know, how we have to really understand the piece. And one of the things we like to talk about is the fact that when you come at something with a conservation viewpoint, you're looking at it from the materials, the scientific, and also the art historical. So that's that combination. And one of the things we do here at Winterthur, which is, again, unusual, is that we have our graduate program with the University of Delaware in art conservation. It's a 3 years master's program, and 2 of the years the students are on site. So that their first year they work in a central lab and get all the various disciplines, and then on their second year they're embedded in the various labs. So that we have 2 students this year who are working in the textile lab. So that's very exciting.
Well, Joy, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your world, and we certainly appreciate all your hard work.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Kristen Matulowicz, the Curator of Community and Academic Programs at the Biggs Museum of American Art, and the art is poppin' here on the 302.
Welcome back. We are now in the Painting Conservation Studio, and I'm joined by Matt Cushman, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what it takes to conserve, to treat very valuable and very old paintings. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, welcome to the Painting Studio.
It's a beautiful space. So tell me a little bit about what it is that you do on a daily basis to get things ready for exhibit.
Sure. So my job is really to take care of the conservation, preservation, and then treatment of these objects, the paintings in the collection, to get them ready for exhibition or just to make sure that they're available for study as well. So when a painting comes to me and someone says this needs to be up on the gallery wall in a year's time or something like that, we spend a lot of time just looking at the painting first and doing a lot of imaging, trying to make sense of how these paintings were put together, get a sense of the artist's practice, the materials that were used, and maybe find some signs about how those materials have degraded over time. Our biggest goal is to make sure that everything is structurally stable and everything's holding together. And then after that, it's trying to get the paintings closer to what we think the artist's original intent was, right? So trying to get the relationship of colors and tones to get closer to where they were before. Maybe there was a coating that was applied at some point that yellowed and darkened, and so we might remove that coating. And thankfully, we have a scientific research and analysis laboratory here at Winterthur too, and they help us to identify materials which help us choose safer treatment options for the objects to make sure that they're ready to go up on the wall. Yeah.
So when you look at a painting and you kind of evaluate it, I know that in some cases there's more than meets the eye.
Sure.
Say, for instance, the painting of the famous painter in the middle here.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that, and how do you discover what's not obvious?
Yeah, so in our routine examination process, we'll often do X-radiography, right? It's just like looking at your bones. You know, if you have a broken bone, your flesh will be less dense than the bones. The same thing goes for, you know, certain artist materials. And in the case of paintings, oftentimes we'll find either slight changes that the artist made, right? They're trying to make decisions about the composition and what's going to look the best, how the eye is going to move around a picture. But at the same time, in the case of this self-portrait of William Williams here, he's changing how he's being presented. So on the lower image that we saw, the earlier composition, it looks like he's holding a letter, trying to show himself as an intellectual. And in the end, he chose to depict himself as a painter instead. So he's, you know, telling us something about himself. In this case, it's a self-portrait. Now, when we are looking at objects as well, we might see issues of condition, so damages that we maybe can't see with the naked eye. Sometimes those will show up in X-ray. And then other imaging techniques we do help us to see maybe the surface of the painting, like what type of coating is there? Is there retouching that we need to be aware of? We might use other techniques that let us see a little bit lower and let us see more of the artist's process. So whether or not they used, let's say, a piece of charcoal to make an underdrawing, we can see that using infrared imaging. So in this whole suite of technical imaging and examination that we do, we try to get the fullest picture we can about how the painting was put together, what that tells us about the artist, their practice, maybe the exchange of ideas. If we're seeing something that one artist did and it's being replicated by a number of other artists, it might tell us a little bit about how these people were trained. And then also, yeah, these condition issues that we as conservators have to kind of keep in mind and maybe take care of in order to get things ready to go up on the gallery wall.
So when you discover something that's hidden, whether it's been overpainted or time and, you know, time's grime has left its imprint, how do you make the decision on how to treat it? I mean, do you actually take some of that away so you can reveal more? I mean, would you, for instance, show him holding the letter, or just let people know on the side in a little narrative that underneath this, there's a letter?
There's a lot of different ways that we could take that information and use it curatorially in an exhibition. We might think about making digital reconstructions of how something might look. If we have a lot of information about what was there, maybe we could take that approach. But for the most part, you know, we might just mention it in a didactic material that's on the side. We would never really think about removing original material to reveal one of these earlier compositions. One of the key tenets of what we do is to make sure that everything we add, everything that we do to a painting has to be reversible, right? Cleaning is the only, well, one of the few things that we do that there's no pretense that things are reversible at all. And so if we have a yellowed coating that's on the surface, that's changing the color balance, right? It's making the whites obviously a little bit yellower, a little bit darker. It's also making the dark colors appear lighter, and it sort of flattens out the color space a little bit. And so, you know, if we look at the waistcoat of the man and right behind me, on one side, on the left side, there's kind of a more yellowish tone that's there. There's a little bit of varnish left behind, and I've removed the varnish on the right-hand side. It's much richer in color, a little bit brighter pinks.
You can really see that.
Yeah, it's not the most extraordinary example maybe of varnish removal, but a subtle one, right? And it makes a difference in getting us closer to what the artist originally intended. And that information too, the color, kind of how the artist is depicting different fabrics, that might give someone who's like a textile conservator or a textile historian an idea of what that type of fabric is, which tells us about who these people were, what sort of economic means they might have had, how do they connect to this global sort of trade, and maybe the nefarious side of that as well, right? So yeah, there's little details that can be picked apart and pulled out of these paintings by our study, by actually conservation treatment, getting things closer to what the artist might have intended.
So once you get it to a point where you have treated it, conserved it, and it's ready to be shown, that's also a big challenge, because you want to make sure that you don't undo the work that you've done, because there are certain things that can, like, what is it, temperature, humidity, and light. So you have to work with the people that, do you coordinate with them on how to do this best, to put it up there? Or?
Sure, yeah. And with our exhibition design team, with the folks who take care of the lighting, we always let them know if we've identified any materials that might be color sensitive or light sensitive. So for instance, the green in his jacket has a yellow pigment in it called orpiment, and it's an arsenic pigment, so it's maybe a sort of dangerous material. It got replaced over time, and part of the reason why it was replaced over time is that it fades, it discolors when it's exposed to a lot of natural light. And that's part of the reason why his green jacket looks a little off right now. It probably would have been a much warmer tone, maybe a little bit more velvety in appearance. And so we want to keep what we have as best we can, and that means, limiting the light that hits that particular painting. Yeah.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for talking with us today, and for all the work that you do.
Thanks.
And we'll be right back.
I'm Rebecca Moore, Director of Somerville Manning Gallery, and I love the creativity of the 302.
Welcome back. We are now in the Furniture Conservation Lab. I'm joined by Kathy Gillis, who is the Senior Furniture Conservator. Kathy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that the furniture that people see when they visit Winterthur, that it's ready, and it's displayed in a way that is educational, but also preserves the history and the story behind it. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, we try to show the way these objects were used, and so in the period room settings, you'll have things arranged. Sometimes they're arranged as they would have been in a room in the period, depending on the room, but some of the rooms in the house are arranged the way Mr. DuPont lived with them. And so you have, for instance, like the DuPont dining room, where it's set up like a dining room would be, and they're also more the higher class of people would have had this furniture that has been collected and that has survived all these years. And so it's a little skewed representation in the house, because things that were preserved by the people who own them, the more expensive furniture that was made by the skilled craftsmen, were bought by wealthy families. And so that's what we mostly have in our collection, and we are expanding that and trying to get more everyday things maybe used by everyone, but those things don't usually survive to the current times. And so the furniture that we have, the bulk of it is from the vision of Henry Francis DuPont and what he collected, and he was really interested in furniture, and so we have just a wonderful collection of furniture.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about and I don't know if this is the correct term, the provenance, is that right, of furniture. How do you determine it? And you have an excellent example of how you do that.
I do have an excellent example. The provenance is following the ownership history of, if you can, in the perfect world, an artisan made something, and then if you have a record, and in our library we have a lot of records from cabinet makers from the colonial times who wrote down, I sold 2 chairs to Mr. Jones and he paid this for them, and I made them out of mahogany, and they're usually abbreviations and cryptic, and so you have to learn to what is he referring to here. But ideally, you have a document from between the maker and the buyer that shows the buyer bought it, when, and then where it went from there, if it descended in the family, and you can look at wills and records where, you know, Mr. Jones Jr. inherited the chairs that Mr. Jones bought from Mr. Smith. And then sometimes you don't get that clear lineage, and you have to go by sales records. Maybe a family sold their house, and then you know that the furnishings went to auction, and you can find an auction catalog. And unfortunately, at that point, there's not a record of who bought it in the auction catalog. Sometimes you get a collector who might have bought it and kept track of it themselves. So the records can be spotty, or they can be really detailed. And so do you want me to talk about these?
Yeah, so tell us about the chairs here, the story that you're working on these now.
Right, and these are very unusual chairs. Well, they have some characteristics that are very specific to a set of chairs that were owned by Alexander Hamilton and his wife Elizabeth Schuyler, and they were ordered for and made for their house in New York called the Grange, which is open to the public now. It's part of the National Park Service. That house was put up for sale. Well, we know the house was built around 1800. They bought the property in 1798, they built the house, they think they moved in around 1802. So between 1798 and 1802, they would have furnished their house or ordered furniture for it, and we know they had an octagonal shaped dining room. They talked about this, people who visited, and we have not found yet records that show us exactly who they ordered the chairs from or who they bought the chairs from. But we do know that in 1809, the property was sold, and there was an ad in a newspaper. That's another thing you can use to track these things down. And I have not tracked all these things down. I'm relying on other people who have, because they are connected to Alexander Hamilton. There's been much interest in, well, what happened to all the things that were in Alexander Hamilton's house, and some things went to auction, some things descended in the family, and so we know, because of the specific inlay and design and construction of these chairs, that and as they got dispersed, that they have enough similarities that they're unique enough that they're part of, we can recognize when we see them, oh, this was part of the Alexander Hamilton Grange dining room. So some of them have gone through art dealers or auction, and actually the one in the far back there that has some upholstery still on it, that chair was purchased in the 1950s, we'll say, by Mr. DuPont, and that was the time the Met acquired one of these chairs. The Albany Institute of Art acquired a pair of them, and so even then we knew it was by Alexander Hamilton, and one of the reasons Mr. DuPont wanted them in the collection. And they seem to have been sold singly or in pairs at that point in time. And then last year we got a call, Josh Lane and I, the curator, to come and look at a set of chairs that were actually here in Delaware, that had descended in a DuPont-related branch of the family, and they had 6 of these chairs, which was amazing that there had been 6 that had stayed together, 2 armchairs and 4 side chairs, and up till that point, no one had seen any armchairs. Every other institution that has them, including ours, just had the side chairs. And so we could tell by the way they were made and how, comparing them to Mr. DuPont's chair, we've also compared them to the Met's chair, the Albany chair, and are certain that they're part of this set of furniture. And so now we have 6 more that we can study and figure out what best way to preserve them and stabilize them because they have some structural issues, and make them presentable to the public. And it comes with the history as well as the life that they've lived between Alexander Hamilton and the owner who donated them to Winterthur.
That's really fascinating, and I'm sure the folks that come to Winterthur to check out all of the exhibits really appreciate your work, as do I. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
To us. We'll be right back. For more information on Winterthur, its exhibits, and its programs, visit winterthur.org. That'll do it for this week's episode of The 302. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. Tell them you saw it on The 302.